First of all, thank you for that sensitive selection from the full criminal record. After that rather brilliant survey we've just heard of the sort of story of cultural diplomacy and soft power, I'm going to see if I can add a few thoughts to it. Not, I hope, sounding too pessimistic, but there are really some very big problems we have to address. I was very struck in what we've just heard, the phrase that cultural diplomacy has in certain aspects been not a uniting, but a divisive, polarizing impact, certainly on international affairs and possibly within societies as well. But I'll come to that in a moment. Now, I feel a bit like a traveling book salesman, because it is out of books over the last 30 years, to which I've tried to contribute, but many more distinguished people have written as well, and they're still pouring out, that the sort of switch has arisen from the old diplomacy of the 1930s, which failed, the League of Nations and so on, the new world we were building with the UN in 1945, with the cry of never again after two bloody and horrific world wars, and then the gradual switch through this last century from realizing that the new diplomacy didn't really work either, and that we needed a new dimension to our international relations, and indeed our relations as human beings, in order to understand how we were going to indeed avoid repetitions of the horrors of the past, or the even worse that now loomed in the nuclear age. So that's why I sound, as I'm constantly referring to books. I start with Joan Nye and soft power, because of course soft power is the sort of economic and industrial dimension of cultural diplomacy. And he's still with us. He's a very, very able man. In fact, I had the honor the other day of interviewing him for a podcast I was doing on what was happening to the world of cultural diplomacy and soft power now. And he remains optimistic, but not so optimistic as he was. Then out of this came the realization that diplomacy was being subject to populism. Popular feeling was creeping into diplomacy. It amused me the other day reading old books that the great Lord Salisbury in this country in the end of the 19th century was deploring the fact that the public were having any say in foreign policy at all. He could see nothing but trouble arising from this, and he had a lot of hand-wringing before he discovered that, I'm afraid, populism was arriving. This is long before the digital age, even before the radio age. And of course, it was popular feeling that increasingly drove the populist sentiments, which are nearly always inward-looking, slightly xenophobic, and very fertile ground for violence and war, as proved in 1914 and in 1939. So that was the sort of story at the end of the last century. And it hasn't, frankly, gone very well. I mean, first of all, Joe Nye himself concedes that the soft power was wonderful, and if applied properly, was going to outlaw, remove, make redundant the old forms of warfare, killing, attacks on civilians, and descent, spiral downward of violence and terror and horror. And a general feeling arose that this wasn't the way things were going. Now, I'm clutching in my hand a book by Robert Kaplan, you've probably read, called The Coming Anarchy. That was published in 2000. That's quarter of a century ago. And he forecast that there was big trouble ahead. We weren't going to have the benefits of cultural diplomacy softening, uniting countries. There was going to be hideous divisions, and they were going to be polarized and made much more extreme by the powers of the digital age, which were going to amplify every extreme message and destroy the center ground of compromise and deliberation on which most of democracy relied. He didn't get it quite right, as I shall come to in a moment, but he generally said that American high-minded efforts to export democracy and bring aid as a weapon to bring to keep people in the countries of their origin and enjoy the sort of nirvana of democratic evolution were all a failure. He said that I think he missed, this is 24 years ago, he missed entirely the point that this would affect America as well, and that the internal politics of America would be, again, subject to the collapse of trust and trustworthiness, but trust and respect, on which, of course, a free society depends, and on which a lot of business depends as well. So he didn't foresee that, but he did foresee that things were not going too well. This message was amplified as we saw the glories of the Arab Spring turn into the horrors of the Arab winter, practically nothing going right. A classic circle in places like Egypt you start with a despot, you overthrow the despot, it goes onto the street turns into a riot because no one agrees with each other on the street, and the call is for a strong man to come back, and you end up with someone just as tyrannical or just much of a dictator as when you started. I mean, in history, we all know what happened with the French Revolution, who ended up with a worse tyrant than they started with by far. So that is what emerged from the Arab scene. I mean, today, of course, we look back with that almost as calm compared with the horrors of the Ukraine, which was, I believe the right word is unprovoked, although many people question that, unprovoked assault, illegal criminal assault by Russia on its neighbor. And of course, we don't look forward to, we stare with horror at the ultimate descent into bestiality that began on October the 7th, with horrors that really belonged not even to the Middle Ages, but at periods before that when human life was regarded as a battle of animals. And of course, since then, the miserable scene of Gaza with thousands and thousands killed, although how many is a matter of strong dispute. But anyway, this is the pattern we've seen, and it has led people to see that the ideas of cultural diplomacy are powerful and good, as they were, in bringing popular feeling at all levels and popular activity and popular cooperation into international relations and into national societies and relations as well, but that it had gone wrong and was not delivering the kind of peace and quiet that we hoped for. Instead, we've inherited, as of now, a pattern of world turmoil, which is, I don't think, as bad as the 1930s, but certainly because of connectivity and hyperconnectivity and constant communication, costless communication, does seem at times, particularly if you read the media, to be as bad, almost as bad as the 1930s. So here we are, and that book, Coming Anarchy, alerted a lot of Americans, particularly, to write books on this, and they have poured out since, and are still pouring out. Read, if you've got time, Mustafa Suleiman's, the man who invented DeepMind, sold it for $18 billion to Hewlett-Packard or something, I can't remember whom. To Meta. Read his book about, he gives a 50-50 chance between holding our societies together. The centre can hold, to quote the opposite of Irish poet Yeats, who said the centre cannot hold. He said 50-50 chance the centre can hold, but the other 50, of course, is that chaos, social breakdown, physical breakdown, total political breakdown occur in the democracies, and we recede into a sort of new dark age. It's a brilliant book. It's a bestseller in America. It's the latest. But when you read it, you'll find dear Amazon recommending you read about 60 other books of the same story. And they're coming out, and more are coming out. I'm myself trying to write, I'm going to publish, and I'll talk about it in a minute, an attempted antidote, a sort of antibiotic, which I'm calling Avoiding the Coming Anarchy. But it is the general pessimism and gloom around the world is very, very striking. You don't hear it in national elections where politicians are busily promising nirvana and higher wages and the end of misery and more for everybody. Of course you don't. But and you certainly didn't hear anything about this in the recent British general election. But nevertheless, in the world as a whole, there is indeed a sort of mood of pessimism and gloom about where things are going. My pessimism and gloom is I'd love a glass of water if I could, because I always need that to keep me going like an old steam engine. In this sequence of unfolding knowledge and really deep analysis of what was wrong with the diplomacy of the last century, first of all, there was this book, then there were a lot of others. Then in 2013, I was given the job of chairing a select committee of Parliament on the soft power scene and why it wasn't working and whether it was working and what the good bits were and so on and so forth, which I did. And we produced a report which didn't have much sort of media impact because very few people understood what we were talking about what soft power was. We called it Persuasion and Power in the Modern World. I've got a copy here, 2013. And it, I think, quietly made an impact. I was asked more or less to go around the entire world, including China, to explain what we were talking about. The Foreign Office ignored it completely, but then, and I've been in government, so I know how governments work, then about 2 years later set up a department of soft power, claiming it to be their own initiative. It wasn't. It was from our book. Anyway, they weren't prepared to give Parliament any credit, but they did set it up. I don't know now whether it still exists. I'm talking about 10 years ago, 2013, 2014. And that was the next marker in this saga. There we claimed that the soft power scene was clearly not working out, and indeed hardly had we gone to press when the worst violation of this vision occurred, and suddenly something happened that poor Joe Nye and others said couldn't happen again, namely an absolutely antiquated, direct, violent, tanks and bombs and killing and murder of civilians story opening in Donbass and Ukraine, which was a bit of a setback. And we have to, and that of course continues to this day. But generally, it helped promote the discussion, and the discussion is in full tilt today. And indeed, what I have to say to you is relevant to reasonably up to the minute in where we are with this whole saga. So that's power and persuasion. We call it power and persuasion in the modern world. Try and get rid of it. You can get copies from the parliamentary bookshop anytime. It's worth a read. So although it's 10 years old, it's still very much in line. Then I took the liberty of writing a book about all this. This was I suppose to talk about 2016 then, 8 years ago, which I called Look Where We're Going. And just to give you a little flavor of the unfolding story, let me just read a paragraph or two from that. This is 8 years ago. This is after Brexit, but before Ukraine, and before a whole lot of other developments which are taking place around us now while I speak. I asked, is there now an open slide to anarchy, at least of opinion, but maybe soon of behavior, as the contract between government and government finally collapses, as political fragmentation takes over, as of course by then it already had done in the Middle East, and as mass audiences, empowered by information, reject authority in all forms. That, of course, is the other side of the coin of total chaos and revolution. Or are there new binding forces? This is me being trying to put some optimism into it. Are there new binding forces at work? Maybe the very forces which pulled apart the old world order, which now give grounds for optimism and for the belief that there is a new era of stability and progress in reach. Some hope. Are the pictures painted of a world without rules, with collapsing rules of international rules of order, with unrest, discontent, global threats and horrors, allegedly widening aid gaps of inequality and reams of statistics in support of utter gloom? Are they misleading us? Are we all being led by the nose by the usual media exaggeration, combined with the polarization which the previous speaker so eloquently talked about?
I argue in this book, this is 2016 still, that in many ways we are being misled. The proposition in the book was that today powers have come to lie not in the cabinet for anything like the past degree, nor in the will of the strong leaders, nor in the jeers and cheers of elected parliaments, nor in the shrill media, nor in the banks, nor in Washington, or some of the other rising empires in Asia, but increasingly in the global networks which create their own pathways and impose their own agendas. That I'm referring, of course, to the new empires, the new vast platforms whose, indeed, their expenditure on research alone, Meta's expenditure on research is more than that of UK, France, Germany, and Spain combined. These are empires of a size not really known in history, except maybe with Alexander the Great, maybe at the height of the Roman Empire, although even that was smaller in reach than these things, because these are really our global powers. And that is where we have got to today. Now, some people, like brilliant historian Neil Ferguson, contend that the hyperconnected billions have finally defeated the hierarchies of the past, heralding a new openness and fluidity, but also a dangerous new volatility in world affairs. Other people say that the power has passed to the new giant monopolies, just as I said, born out of the information revolution, and now far larger and more influential than even the largest nations. So these are the present-day dilemmas, which we can't be blind to by merely saying we want cultural diplomacy and more unity. You're up against what I'm describing. You're up against these vast public. And the question is, of course, how to bring them within the reach of democratic control. And every parliament in the world is now struggling with very complex legislation as to how this should be done without killing free speech, and so on. These were all the thoughts of 8 years ago. Now, the scroll forward. We scroll forward into the horrors of October the 7th. We scroll forward into the continuing stalemate horrors of the Donbass. We scroll forward into the way in which Xi Jinping, who's obviously getting into a weaker political position, is eyeing forceful action against Taiwan to sort of restore his popularity and give purpose to the Chinese situation. I don't think that will happen immediately, but there are many in this town who I talk to who say that any further indication from either Japan or America that they will pile on the weaponry and help Taiwan to a much further degree will be met by China laying siege to and surrounding Taiwan in 3 hours. In 3 hours. In other words, they have the equipment and capacity to really strangle, suffocate Taiwan, particularly, of course, as applies to any links by air as well as by sea and everything else, and cabling as well. So that's the not so happy a situation we face, and the question is, where do we go from here? Well, you've got a new government here in London, talks about national renewal. Every government talks about national renewal nowadays, and a rediscovery, I'm quoting Prime Minister, a rediscovery of who we are. Tricky one to the British. Are we European? Are we pro-American? Or are we trying to carve a new place in a completely transformed world in which power lies in Asia and not in the Atlantic area at all? Is there still something called the West? I think my only quarrel, and I'd love to talk with your excellent lecturer just before me, used the term the West. Doesn't mean much anymore. I mean, if you talk to Australians and the Japanese, either they say we are the West, which geographically they're not, or they get very offended that somehow there's a sort of gang around the Atlantic that cuts them out. It's not actually an ideological East-West struggle anymore. It's a power and it's a digital struggle. It's a power struggle, certainly of the original kind, between people who want to keep in power. Obviously, Mr. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are the best examples, but there are many others, and those who are prepared to let some kind of democracy, first illiberal, then increasingly liberal, and then sometimes openly liberal, to evolve and ride its way with capitalist reform, which I'll come to in a moment, alongside, in order that we can have a slightly less angry and grumbling world. I don't think, incidentally, that anyone can paint a picture of complete world peace, although you aspire, and we all aspire to such a thing. There's never world peace. There's always going to be some quarrels. It's human beings. Nor is there going to be total consensus in any society. You can get agreement to disagree or agreement to obey the majority even when you don't agree with it. That is the basis of national sovereignty. But you can't. The idea that consensus can be achieved, it can't. Human beings are too varied, interests are too varied, and the idea that there's always going to be peace, no, there's no more going to be peace and complete elimination of quarrels everywhere than you can imagine peace in a nursery or between angry family debating and so on. There is never peace, but there is a framework in which the dangers of peace can be contained, and there is a framework in which people have enough respect and loyalty to agree that even though something is decided against their interests, they comply with it, and the rule of law, and they pay their taxes. That's the national bargain. That's the national bargain. And in return for that, the state will protect, it will provide basic services, deliver them competently, which again is a very questionable proposition nowadays, and it will keep crime off the streets, and it will have an adequate defense against any foreign powers that try to intrude. That's the nation-state bargain, and a lot of books are now saying this bargain is under attack and coming apart, and that it's the tyrannies who are getting ahead with long-range investment and so on, railways from Russia through to Central Asia, and a vast drive towards energy transition through reasonably clean nuclear power and renewables and so on, at a pace which the democracies find it very hard to, certainly to finance, there's a new problem there, but also to get going at all, because these things aren't always popular. Many aspects are very unpopular. So that is why I've tried to put before you, or I am putting before you, and my publishers will put before you in the next few weeks, a book which I've called Avoiding the Anarchy that need not come. And I'm going to try and gather support, which will be a minority for the moment, I think, in favor of the proposition contained in those words. The problem is this, and I don't think this is what enough politicians or diplomats fully comprehend. It is this. We are in the midst of a very, very fast-changing scene, unique in history. Innovative technology waits for no one, and it is altering, transforming, upending, opening every day, every week and every day. So I can't give you a nice list of exactly to-do things to stop or to avoid. I'll give you a few ideas just at the close if I haven't gone on too long. But you can't expect from me a sort of neat legislative program which will, hey presto, bring the whole of all these trends to an end. Thanks to the microchip and the expansion by literally billions of times of its capacity to carry tiny transistors. I think the latest microchips carry 17 billion transistors. The original ones carried 4. 4, not 4 billion, just 4. Human life, relations and behavior, for all but a very few, have changed profoundly. That's a message that sounds obvious, but you'll be amazed how that is ignored in a lot of discussion in politics, certainly in this country, maybe in others as well. Chips have created the modern world, and they've brought not just one more innovation in modern life, but really given us a turning point in the pattern of human relations and affairs. Comparable, I would argue, or maybe even exceeding the spread of the printing press, the Gutenberg Revolution, or the powerful influence of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, or the steam age, or anything that's followed it. Even language is altered. Instant, ceaseless, almost costless connectivity has transformed everyone and everything. It is the driving force in the huge shift of power across the globe. So now, finally, 3 messages, and he's told us how this is all terrible and hand-wringing usual. You get what you get from politicians, but what on earth do we do about it? And also, I would add, it has completely upset the international order and created a burning need, literally burning, because cars get burned every day, for a new international deep cooperation in addressing climate dangers, pandemics and disease, the movement of millions, indeed billions, and a new generation of weapons control, the old one having fallen apart under the pressures of modern Russian aggression. And, of course, American equal and opposite internal nationalism as well. So that's the first. If you want a message, the first is that we have to get over to our politicians that these are changes of a global scale. They are changes in human relations, from the very humblest inside a family, how their children treat their parents, who goes truant and who doesn't, who disappears upstairs to their computers and argues with their parents, and families, much harder things to run nowadays than they were, right the way up through communities that want to stick together or not. And we in Britain are struggling with that one all the time, with Scotland separatism, Welsh not so bad, a separate problem which I won't bore you with today of Northern Ireland, where I spent 2 or 3 years of my life trying to stop the killing, and other aspects of keeping a united kingdom together. But how do we create a sort of centre which holds people together sufficiently? They're not going to agree on everything, holds them together sufficiently to maintain a reasonable degree of unity. Incidentally, there is a sub-message here. I try to contain my time, but people, the middle, the moderate, why don't they get together attitude is not what people think. Most people think, oh, what he's talking about is halfway between socialism and conservatism, between the individual and the market versus the state and state control. We've had that debate for years. We know all about that. And people who try to go down the middle line tend to get knocked over or sunk into a quagmire of failed compromises. I'm not talking about that. The centre today, in an age of constant communication evolution, isn't in between. It isn't the old sort of Butskillism. Some of you may remember that term from the politics of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But it's what lies ahead, not between. In other words, the true centre of politics today is nowhere near the supposed midway between the left and the right. Don't bother me with those phrases anymore. They come from the French Revolution. They're completely out of date and irrelevant to the analysis of modern political thought. They're leftover expressions from the French Revolution. The issue lies in the foremost frontiers of political ideas, wherever they're being created and assembled and wherever they're pointing. The common ground is the future ground. That's the point. Not them cutting half a loaf each way about the present political scene, whether it's in Anglo-Saxon democracies or indeed anywhere else. Pictorially, I've tried to find the right words in the book I'm going to inflict on the public shortly as to what I mean. And the nearest I can get to it is geese or wild ducks or flamingos fly in a formation under a leader. They're heading ahead. So if you're trying to think of common ground, think what lies ahead and we're being led to by leaders. They begin to have the basis on which there can be increased unity and effective dialogue in cultural relations. And the centre ground is not what appears as the common overlapping uses of current beliefs, doctrines, and aims now which the media joyfully dabble in. It is, as I say, the common way ahead, and that is where our direction has to be guided, and that's what we have to prepare for. And this is the centre of the modern, fluid, and evolutionary politics of the digital age, the place where the new politics of artificial intelligence, of global people movement, which is on a vast scale, we ain't seen nothing yet, of climate containment and space mastery, all connected to each other, I may say, are addressed. It is a centre that must and should lead, forming the spearhead of political perception and motivation. So those are the approaches. They're not measures and they're not laws that I have to offer you in avoiding the coming anarchy. There's just two precise additions to it. The first is that, no, one addition. The first is that, although you may not like it, the reform of capitalism and the search for capitalist democracy or democratic capitalism is associated with the democracy itself. That's what brilliant minds like those of Dr. Jürgen Habermas, who's considered the wisest man in Europe, have argued and are arguing in their current books. So we come to an immediate message, which is also going to be in the pages of my book, that a new agenda of priority measures is needed to stabilize the world's financial system and create the capitalist democracy, which people have been talking around for 60 or 70 years and somehow have never got round to. It's not much liked on the far left. It's not much liked on the far right either, because on the far left they say they don't like capitalism, despite the fact that it's been abandoned by China, where they have, of course, state police back to capitalism, or Russia, where they have a sort of mafia mobster capitalism, or North Korea, where they have nothing to do with socialism. It's a family tyranny of a particular poisonous kind. So capitalism is actually, as a world cause, doesn't. The argument with socialism no longer exists. People are calling themselves socialists, but no one's pursuing socialist economics anymore on this planet because it doesn't work and leads to worse problems than it seeks to solve. And the need, as the philosophers are now telling us, not the politicians, is to have a reform of the capitalist system to spread wider ownership and enable very wide numbers, not just a few, to benefit from the growth of assets and the improvement in economic circumstances, which at present appears to be not only not helping the majority, wages are rising a bit but not much, but to be concentrated on asset accumulation for very few people right at the top of the pyramid on an absolutely colossal scale, equal to medieval times or the 19th century or worse. People used to think, oh, well, if we hang on to make speeches about capitalism, that will be all right. And in the pre-digital age, that's what we got away with. Harry Macmillan used to say about people's condition, where they'd never had it so good. That was in the 1950s, and probably then, in terms of wages, it was true. But at the same time, the divisions were beginning to grow and have now vastly increased to the point where levelling up sounds a cynical, unattainable mission. I end with just this flaw. We've got a new government here who talk, as I say, of national renewal. They also talk of mission control, which is another word for national renewal, or attending to the sort of issues that I've been discussing. And they will need to realize some of the things I've tried to suggest, and that it is not a question of business as usual. They will have to show that they can mobilize investment from the private sector, difficult for a left-wing government, from the private sector, because while all the ambitions and needs are in the public sector, in the democracies, in fact everywhere, all the money is in the private sector and in the sovereign wealth funds, which I have the privilege of advising, one of the biggest, and in the pension funds, which are enormous, used to be invested in this country, in Britain, at 40%, now 4%. Insurance funds, 60%, now 3%. All gone. The investment funds, which have got to be mobilized to rebuild this country where it is broken. And it is broken in some areas because of the problems of trying to deliver to not a unified populace all demanding the same thing, but a babel of different populisms all demanding often contradictory things, which cannot be reconciled. Hence the difficulty of governments. Even this new government, they've only had about 2 minutes in government, and they're already in deep water. They were impossibly reconcilable issues. Final thought. The great Lord Keynes, who I worship, who was at my college at King's, although he'd been dead 10 years when I arrived, saviour of liberal capitalism in the fascistic and communist polarised madness and evil of the 1930s, had the message which still resonates today, to which it is that the essays and articles in this volume that I'm going to write also try and give support. The argument, he insisted, was not just about economic theories or ideologies or monetarism versus some other ism, or against obvious and undisputed despotic evil. It was against those who were still missing the significance of what was really happening and who refused to acknowledge that we had moved into a totally and completely different environment. And that was the 1930s, and that is the 2020s and 2030s as well. So a completely different environment now, both globally and domestically. So I just left with you saying, good reading. Please try and get that message around, and our courses will make some progress. At present, they're not doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Howell, I'm going to ask you just to stay there for a moment while questions are raised. But I just want to add, not only is he a lord, a published author, a minister that has stood in 3 successive prime ministers' governments, but I'm going to also add he's a visionary. Would you not agree?
Yes.
So in terms of that, Lord Howell, would you mind just taking some questions, please?
I'll be honoured to
Thank you.
Try and take some questions.
First question, please.
At the back there, there's one.
Hello. Hi there. Hi, Lord. Thank you for your very, very deep evaluation, both locally and globally as well. I just have a couple of questions. Just two. The first one I'll start as local. You've probably heard about the strong men create hard times create strong men, weak times or easy times create weak people, that sort of thing. Where do you think the UK is on that scale? And how bad do you think it can get? Are we talking about like civil war? Or I know that's worst case scenario, but you know, we've just seen some local riots just 3 weeks ago, and I'm not saying that's related to the anarchy and the fall of civilization here in the UK or how things are, but how bad can that go? And I'll just ask the second question as well, because it's a short one. We know you mentioned the East and the West and how it's kind of still there, but not so much. What role do you think BRICS plays in the new East and West? Because it's pretty much East and West now, isn't it? You've got the big superpowers from the East.
No, it's not. No.
Thank you.
So that's the question. Let me tackle that one immediately. No, it's not East and West anymore. On the contrary, we have to learn a great deal more from India in its right mood. And India is a fascinating mixture of moods, as you can see. Hugging Mr. Putin one morning and hugging democracy the next. It's, you know, they're feeling their way as the largest nation on earth. I think they're bigger than China, and a fabulous nation at that. So we have to work with them very closely. We have the Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia. We have the Commonwealth network, 56 countries and growing. Rather an interesting example, because all the know-alls on the literary cognoscenti and the bien pensant said, oh, Commonwealth, that's finished. That's yesterday. That's some old empire. That's just a lot of idiot empire longers saying they should recreate. It's nonsense. The Commonwealth today is actually a network, and a very fascinating one, and it's got some binding forces in it. Not, of course, looking to Britain. That's absurd. We're just one member in the network now. They have got a common language commercially, not obviously domestically in every case, which is a great binding force. But above all, the Commonwealth is not just governments. Commonwealth is a fantastic network of professions and linkages and people and school children even, and universities and veterinary surgeons and training efforts and research and psychology and all states of the law, the magistrates, the judges, and even the structures of parliamentary committees. These are things that are being discussed and dialogued every day in detail by the 56 members of the Commonwealth. Not all of them, we don't get them all along. Some of their governments are quite rude about Britain still, say a bunch of damn colonialists, we don't want their lecturers. Some of them acknowledge that we should be giving more physical aid. We do our best, we must do a lot more.
Some are just not interested, so they say. But at the people, that's governments. But at the people level, there's fantastic networking going on the whole time, which politicians don't understand and fully comprehend. Certainly foreign officers don't. Diplomats find it very difficult, because here we're talking about things that don't immediately involve diplomats. And so a diplomat can find it very hard to see what is going on in our relations with India, in relations between Australia and India and Pakistan, a difficult problem, the India-Pakistan problem itself, which is an agonizing issue which somehow the Commonwealth just contains, because they're both members of the Commonwealth, but they're deadly enemies of each other, and New Zealand and all the rest. There's just the East-West concept belongs to the old American Liberal Party and actually all American politics, which says, there's a Manichaean divide between the good and the evil, and between our ideology of markets and freedom of speech and so on, and the dark ideologies of leftovers of communism and state fascism and so on. Actually, the real world's not like that at all. Not like that at all. And if you approach it that way, you'll get into constant disappointment. So I think that's my first point, that we have to understand the shades of democracy, the purest ones, which are usually thoroughly volatile, and as Plato and Aristotle forecast, and Socrates as well, they said they'll all end in tears, or in tyrannies of various kinds, as many of them have. Then the ordered parliamentary democracies, which we try and run here, with difficulty in the digital age, because the instruments of our democracy are not trusted. MPs are considered often individually very politely, but collectively as a bunch of corrupt idiots and out of touch. The civil service is no longer trusted the way it was, and there's a general feeling that the parties are linked to old ideologies of left and right, which simply don't exist anymore, and that the new problems of climate, migration, hyperinflation, the solution to the whole energy issue, aren't being addressed in a proper way. Maybe a new government with a big majority and a mission control sentiment can do something about this. But generally, people have got less and less time and a demand for more and more devolution, which up to a point is fine, and we had it in the 1970s and 80s, but if you devolve too much, you put power down to areas which may not use it wisely, to put it in its most obvious point. And if you think about planning and housing for 5 minutes, you'll see exactly what I mean. So those are the problems. So that doesn't answer your first question.
Thank you very much. May I take just one more question? Pardon? Pardon. Thank you.
Lord Howell, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. My name is Pardon, from Zimbabwe. From Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Allow me to take you to the former colony of Great Britain. I want to understand from your perspective in avoiding anarchy, looking at the current events that we find ourselves in Zimbabwe. 17 November 2017, there was a coup which was not a coup, possibly supported by a number of countries, including the UK. Coming to now, as we speak, the election that passed, there is a number of issues which literally point to the legitimacy of the outcome of those elections. I want to find out from your perspective in avoiding anarchy, how does the UK seek to resolve some of the issues we find ourselves, the opposition members being arrested and so on and so forth? How do you see these issues being resolved? Because there's definitely need to be a solution to the crisis in Zimbabwe. And what will be your view on that?
Well, let's start from your own enormous and powerful and very interesting country, Zimbabwe. And I'll first of all offer you not with the UK's view, but my own longing, which is to see Zimbabwe with some stability within, not necessarily a Westminster model, but some stability within, rejoining the Commonwealth. As you know, it was in the Commonwealth. It walked out under Mugabe. It would have probably been chucked out anyway because funny things were going on. And it stays outside. It would be excellent. And indeed, its present government, although they don't quite seem to have grasped that Commonwealth does mean sort of aspirations of a democratic kind. It doesn't mean detailed parliaments and commons and lords and all that nonsense, but it does mean a freedom under the law. It does mean independent judiciary and so on. They keep saying, why can't we come back in now? So there's a pressure going on, which is during the last Commonwealth conference here in London 4 years ago, I was being invited to Zimbabwe events almost every day, where I got the same message, which is, please can we join again? And the Commonwealth Secretariat under Patricia Scotland, who's an able woman, the Secretary General, she's coming to the end of her time now, was saying, no, you don't conform to the Charter. We haven't got a treaty. We're not a treaty bossy organisation like the EU. We haven't got a sort of rules you have to stick by with a lot of lawyers hovering around, but we have got a charter with a general aspiration to freedom under the law, independent judiciary, free speech, parliamentary aspirations, the basic sort of virtues that we tried to develop in this country, on this island, over the last 500 years. So I'm afraid the application is not going terribly well. Anyway, that's my personal view. What can we in Britain do as members of the network? We're not a hub with spokes and all that sort of nonsense. We're members of a network. It's quite a different thing with different relations. Now, what can we do to contribute to better times for the great Zimbabwe? There's a whole list of things we can do dealing with the problems of very large numbers of Zimbabweans who are over the frontier in South Africa, dealing with the economics of it, dealing with the way, how far have Zimbabwe gone in accepting the blandishments of the Chinese with their bags of coal and their instant railways and so on. How do we cope with that? We may have to cooperate in some cases with the Chinese. They're not all bad, but although some of their motives are very, very questionable. And how do we steer a different path to the one which not only the past dictatorship, but the present dominance seems to be pursuing? I think that's all I can give you on Zimbabwe. I'd give you some statistics. The Commonwealth used to be 8 members when it was set up in 49. This is the modern not the British Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth of Nations. It grew to 48, then it grew to the early 50s. Then when I was Minister of the Commonwealth, which was 10 years ago now, it was 53. Then one, I think, came back. Was it the Maldives that had gone out in a half, 54. Then last summer, two more Francophone countries said they wanted to join the Anglophone because they wanted to be in on the big world affairs and not sort of cut out the whole time, and didn't like being bossed around by Paris, but they did like the gentler approach of London. So we got 2 more then, and 3 more have indicated since. So we're nearly at 60. 60 is half the world, actually. In terms of population, it's about 1/3 of the entire planet, as long as we keep India on board. And that's, people say, well, what's it for? What's it for? And, nice talking, dinner at Buckingham Palace with the reigning British monarch, who's still head of it, as designated by our lovely Queen, who died. One of the things she's persuaded the Commonwealth is, why not have my son as the head of it? He's not a British politician. He's a lot better than all your alternatives. So let's have a real independent. So he succeeded, and he's realizes the weight upon him. And that's, people say, what else is there for the Commonwealth? And the answer is what I've described to you. The networks work of their own accord. They don't need governments to order them. They work through the day and the night, and they link and they dialogue and they talk. I will end with a final anecdotal remark. My colleague, Martha Lane Fox, who's Baroness and has in the past Conservative government, was supervising some of our digital development inside government, said she visited a primary school, that's up to 7 or 8, in Northumberland, and began by saying, well, I want to talk about the Commonwealth. You won't have heard of it, of course, and you won't know about it, but it is the relic of empire and so on. And a little boy at the front, aged about 7, said, we know all about the Commonwealth. We're actually subcontracting our daily homework to Singapore every morning. And that shut her up. There was a nice bit of networking going on that no one knew about. And there is a lot that no one knows about, except people like you, who I'm sure follow these things closely. But the media are gloriously ignorant. So what have I said? I've said really that we love a world in which there's a gentle, non-over-centralized, non-treaty, non-bullying, non-state, party-dominated organization in the world, which fits in probably better than any other, even NATO, even the United Nations possibly, to the world that's coming, in which is going to be a divided world, yes, not between East and West, but in many other ways. There are going to be terrible battles, not between capitalism and socialism, because that's all over, that's all in the dustbin, but there are going to be local tribal battles, there are going to be horrors like October the 7th, I'm afraid, unless some miracle changes the minds of Hamas or the Israelis, who I admire, but they always go over the top. They always play too rough a game, and they lose international sympathy as a result. But that's another story we mustn't start on here. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Can we have a big round of applause for Lord David Howell?
Thank you.
Sorry, with respect.